For a family whose history has been written in headlines, cameras, and front-page moments, this goodbye happened almost in secret. No broadcast. No statement at the door. No crowd watching from behind velvet ropes. Just police barricades, muted footsteps, and a church that closed its doors before the world could look inside. On a cold January morning in New York City, the Kennedy family gathered at the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola on the Upper East Side, the same church that once held the funeral of Jackie Kennedy, to bury Tatiana Schlossberg. She was 35 years old. There were no speeches released, no footage from inside, no live stream, not even a confirmation of who sat in which pew. For one of the most public families in American history, this farewell was built entirely out of silence. And that silence wasn't accidental. It was chosen, because this wasn't meant to be a moment for history books, or cameras, or strangers. This was a moment the family wanted to keep for themselves. But in keeping it private, they created something else instead. They created questions. Why this church? Why this level of secrecy? Why no statements? Why no official guest list? And why did one name, in particular, seem to hang over the day even without being spoken? To understand what really happened that morning, you have to start not with what was said, but with what wasn't. Because on this day, the loudest thing in the room was the quiet. And the quiet was doing more talking than anyone realized. But that silence didn't begin inside the church. It began outside. By late morning, the streets around the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola were already controlled. Police officers blocked off sections of the Upper East Side. Barricades created distance between the entrance and the public sidewalk. Traffic was redirected. Pedestrians were moved along. The press was kept far enough away that even telephoto lenses couldn't capture much more than distant figures slipping through doors. There were no signs, no banners, no public notice beyond a quiet acknowledgement that something important was happening inside. And that was exactly the point. This wasn't meant to be a public event. It wasn't meant to be witnessed. It wasn't meant to be shared. People didn't arrive together. They arrived in waves. Extended family members were seen first. Carrie Kennedy, Joe Kennedy III. Familiar names, familiar faces, but entering quietly, without pause, without acknowledgement of the cameras that waited beyond the barricades. Then came Tatiana's parents. Caroline Kennedy and Edwin Schlossberg walked in without spectacle, without comment, without the outward ceremony that once followed Caroline everywhere she went. Her siblings, Rose and Jack, entered separately. Not as a statement, not as distance, just as people moving through grief in their own timing. Later came Tatiana's husband, George Moran. With him were their two children, Edwin and Josephine. Their presence changed the feeling of the day. Because this wasn't just a funeral. It was a gathering of people who had lost a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother. And the children were the living reminder of what had been taken too soon. Inside the church, there were no reporters, no photographers, no observers. Whatever happened there belonged only to the people in the room. No one knows who spoke. No one knows what was said. No one knows who cried first. And that wasn't a failure of reporting. It was a boundary, a line the family drew and refused to let the world cross. But even from outside, the shape of the day could be felt. This was not a ceremony built around legacy. It was built around loss. And every detail pointed to that. The location was symbolic, but the mood was not. There were no dramatic gestures, no public mourning, no attempt to turn grief into a message. This wasn't history being made. This was history stepping back. And yet, even in privacy, the people who walked through those doors told a story. Not with words, but with presence. Because every person who came represented a chapter of Tatiana's life. And each arrival mattered. But that wasn't the whole story. Because as people watched who entered the church, they also watched for who didn't. The guest list wasn't published. But the faces that appeared were enough to map the shape of Tatiana Schlossberg's world. This wasn't a room filled with politicians or power players. It was filled with people who had touched her life in specific, personal ways. Her immediate family, of course. Her parents, Caroline and Edwin. Her siblings, Rose and Jack. Her husband, George. Her children. Then the extended family. Kennedys who were bound not by headlines, but by shared history. Carrie Kennedy. Joe Kennedy III. Names that the public recognizes, but whose presence that day wasn't about status. It was about connection. Then came people who didn't belong to the family at all. David Letterman. a late-night icon who had long since stepped away from the spotlight, appearing quietly, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had known Tatiana personally. Carolina Herrera. Not just a fashion designer, but the woman who created Tatiana's wedding dress. Someone connected not to her illness, but to one of her happiest moments. David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker. The man who had published Tatiana's final essay. The person who had helped her share her voice with the world. None of these people were random. They weren't there because Tatiana was a Kennedy. They were there because Tatiana was Tatiana. A writer, a bride, a mother, a friend, a woman who had touched their lives in ways that had nothing to do with politics or power or public identity. The guest list read less like a political network and more like a personal archive, and that made the absence of spectacle make sense. This wasn't about who she was to the world. It was about who she was to them. But as observers watched who entered, they also noticed something else. A name that never appeared. A presence that was never confirmed. And a silence that felt louder than all the others. Because one person's absence, or possible absence, carried weight far beyond the doorway. And whether he was there or not, the question itself became part of the story. And that's where the quiet of the day started to feel complicated. Because in a room full of people who loved her, there was also the shadow of a relationship that had ended in tension. And that tension hadn't disappeared with her. It had followed her into the church, even if no one spoke it out loud. By the afternoon, as the doors of the church remained closed and the last guest slipped inside, one question hovered over the day without ever being spoken. Was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. there? No confirmation was given. No denial was issued. No family member clarified. And that ambiguity alone became meaningful. Because this wasn't just another relative. This was the cousin Tatiana had written about. The cousin whose political choices had crossed directly into her personal reality. The cousin whose decisions she had watched from a hospital bed. In her New Yorker essay, Tatiana didn't speak in abstract terms. She didn't argue in slogans or rhetoric. She wrote as someone watching her own time disappear, while policies shifted in ways that felt painfully close. She wrote about funding cuts to cancer research, about money being pulled away from programs that had the potential to help people like her, about technology that could have mattered. She wrote not as a critic looking outward, but as a patient looking inward. And in doing so, she turned a family disagreement into something heavier. She turned it into a question of values, of priorities, of what matters when someone you love is running out of time. She didn't attack. She didn't rage. She wrote calmly. But calm honesty can sometimes cut deeper than anger ever could. And that honesty changed the shape of that relationship. It introduced a fracture into a family already shaped by history, loss, and complexity. So when the day of her funeral arrived, people looked for him, not because they wanted a confrontation, but because they wanted to know what the silence meant. Was it respect? Was it distance? Was it unresolved tension? Or was it simply something the family chose not to make public? No one knows. And that not knowing became part of the emotional weight of the day. Because when someone dies young, people look for meaning. They look for closure. They look for signs that things were made right before the end. But this story didn't offer that. It offered quiet instead. It offered unanswered questions. And it offered a family choosing not to explain itself. That choice wasn't cold. It wasn't defensive. It was consistent. Consistent with the way this entire goodbye had been constructed. Minimal. Contained. Private. Because this wasn't a day for resolving conflict. It was a day for holding grief. And grief doesn't need explanations. It needs space. And that space was exactly what the family protected, even when the world wanted more. But that brings us to the real question. Why did this funeral look the way it did? Why was it so quiet, so controlled, so closed off? The answer doesn't start with politics. It starts with Tatiana herself. To understand the shape of this goodbye, you have to understand the person it was built for. Tatiana Schlossberg never chased attention. She didn't build a public persona. She didn't cultivate celebrity. She didn't use her name as a platform. She used it as a responsibility. She wrote about the environment, about history, about the planet, about long timelines and fragile systems. She wasn't interested in being seen. She was interested in being understood. Even in her final essay, when she knew millions of people would read her words, she didn't perform. She didn't dramatize. She didn't turn her illness into spectacle. She wrote about swimming while pregnant, about feeling healthy, about disbelief, about missing her children, about the strangeness of watching the world continue while her own narrowed. It was intimate, personal, almost private, even when it was public. So it makes sense that her funeral reflected that same instinct. This wasn't meant to be a moment of national mourning. It was meant to be a moment of personal remembering. The family didn't hide the funeral. They simply didn't offer it. They didn't deny the public access. They just didn't invite it. That's an important difference. And it's one that's rare in a family so used to being watched. They chose a church tied to their history. But they chose privacy over ceremony. They chose silence over statements. They chose intimacy over influence. They chose to grieve as a family, not as a symbol. And that choice is what gave the day its power. Not the names, not the location, not the legacy, but the restraint. Because restraint in a world built on attention feels almost radical. And in that way, this funeral said more about Tatiana than any speech ever could. It said she was not a headline. She was not a story. She was not a moment. She was a person. And this goodbye was built for people, not for history. But that doesn't mean history stayed out. Because even when a family tries to hold something close, meaning still finds its way in. And that meaning lives in the words Tatiana left behind. Words that now feel heavier than they did when she wrote them. Words that have become something else entirely. They've become a goodbye she never intended to write, but one she wrote anyway. When Tatiana Schlossberg wrote her essay for The New Yorker, she didn't frame it as a farewell. She framed it as an observation, an attempt to understand what was happening to her while it was happening. She wrote about sitting in a hospital bed and watching the world continue outside the window, about watching news unfold, about watching politics shift, about watching time slip. She wrote about the moment doctors spoke words that didn't seem real. She wasn't sick. She didn't feel sick. She had been swimming. She had been pregnant. She had been alive in a way that didn't feel fragile. And then suddenly, she was told she was. Her writing didn't rush. It didn't accuse. It didn't dramatize. It noticed. It noticed how strange it felt to be healthy one day and seriously ill the next. It noticed how quickly language changes when it's applied to you instead of someone else. It noticed how the future becomes a different shape when you're not sure how long it is anymore. But the most powerful part of her writing wasn't about her illness. It was about her children, about her son knowing that she was a writer, that she wrote about the planet, that she wanted him to know she was more than a patient, more than a diagnosis, more than a hospital room. And then there was her daughter, her newborn, the child she couldn't hold, the child she couldn't bathe, the child she couldn't feed. Because love suddenly had to exist at a distance. Because touch suddenly became dangerous. Because motherhood suddenly became something she had to imagine instead of live. She wrote about not knowing who her daughter thought she was. About not knowing if her daughter would remember her. About not knowing if she would ever feel like a mother to her. That kind of honesty is rare. Not because people don't feel it, but because people don't usually say it. Especially not in public. Especially not when the audience is the entire world. And now, in hindsight, those words read differently. They don't read like reflection. They read like preparation. Like someone quietly trying to make sure that if she disappeared, she left a version of herself behind. Not for the public. For her children. For the people she loved. For the people who would one day wonder who she was. In that sense, Tatiana didn't leave a legacy. She left a message. And that message is what gives her funeral its weight. Because the goodbye didn't happen in the church. It happened on the page, weeks earlier, quietly, without knowing that it would become a goodbye at all. And that makes it heavier. Not because she knew she was leaving, but because she didn't, and still wrote like someone who understood that time is never promised, and that love is never guaranteed a long future, only a real one. Most funerals feel like endings. This one doesn't. It feels like a pause, a held breath, a moment that hasn't quite settled into the past yet. Because Tatiana Schlossberg didn't leave behind a closed story. She left behind children who will grow up with questions. She left behind a family still processing what it lost. She left behind words that still feel present. She left behind a life that didn't finish unfolding. And that makes the funeral feel incomplete in a way that no ceremony could ever fix. There was no final chapter. No sense of resolution. No neat emotional closure. Just a young woman gone. And a room full of people trying to hold what was left. That's why people are still talking about this. Not because it's tragic. Not because it's famous. Not because it's controversial, but because it's unfinished. And unfinished stories stay with us. They don't let us move on easily. They sit with us. They echo. They remind us that time is not fair, that plans are fragile, that health is temporary, that love is everything. This funeral wasn't meant to close a chapter. It was meant to acknowledge that one had been cut short. And in that acknowledgement, there's something deeply human. Because no amount of ceremony can complete what wasn't allowed to finish. All we can do is remember, and carry forward what remains. Her words, her work, her children, her quiet honesty. That's the legacy. Not a name, not a lineage, not a headline, but a voice that chose to speak gently in a world that often speaks loudly. And that voice still feels close. Even now, even after the church doors closed, even after the guests went home, even after the cameras turned away. Tatiana Schlossberg's funeral didn't try to be historic. It didn't try to be symbolic. It didn't try to be seen. It tried to be real. It tried to give a family a space to say goodbye without being watched, to grieve without performing, to remember without explaining. And in doing that, it revealed something rare. That even in the most public of families, there can still be moments that belong only to the people inside them. The loudest thing about that day wasn't a speech. It wasn't a conflict. It wasn't a presence or an absence. It was the quiet. A quiet that held grief, that held love, that held things too heavy for words. And maybe that's the only kind of goodbye that ever truly fits a life like hers. Not one that tries to define it, but one that simply lets it be remembered.